Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Todd Caldwell. I'm with the State Board of Accounts, and joining me today is Mike Crowley. We are happy to be here with you today and talk about some things as we continue our monthly webinar series, and we call it monthly. I know we don't have it every month, but when we started this, what we tried to do is make contact with local officials once every month. So the last time I think we did this was April, and then in May we were at the budget workshop and clerk treasurer school, and then in June, obviously the annual conference. So in a month where we're not somewhere presenting in person is when we try to have these monthly webinars. So we're glad you're with us today. I hope everyone can hear and see, because this is the first time I've been involved with this without Susan. Susan usually handled this, and I kind of relied on her for that. And I have notes, but we've had a few technical glitches this morning already, and so Mike, being the computer expert that he is, has helped get us into that area. So I think we're good to go now. If you have any trouble hearing and you're able to get to the Q&A, you can go ahead and put something in there. We'll be looking at that. We've turned off the chat feature this time. In the past, we've had the chat and the Q&A, and people would put questions in both, and it was a little difficult to go back and forth between the two. So if you do have a question, you can put it in the Q&A, and after the presentation, we will go over those. As you know, if you've been in this webinar before, you know that we do the first half of it on presentation materials, and then we open it up for questions. So we'll get to that in a little bit. I do want to say too, we are recording this, so if you just love it so much you want to go back and look at it again in a few days, you can. And I say a few days, it might be 10 days to 2 weeks before we're able to get the video pulled down from the cloud and edited and then up on our website for you to look at. But it will be there eventually, along with the PowerPoint or the PDF materials at some point in the future. So if you know someone who missed it, or maybe they couldn't get connected for whatever reason, you can let them know that within a couple of weeks it should be available to view. So with that, I think we can go ahead and move forward with our agenda. What are we going to talk about today? What's on tap? We're going to start with a discussion on electronic transactions. So receiving payments electronically as well as making electronic payments. Then Mike's going to talk to you about some questions and things that we can get periodically on nepotism, and then contracting with a unit, which is very similar to the nepotism thing. It talks about an elected official contracting with certain people, certain relatives. So let's jump into the electronic part, and we'll first talk about receiving payments. Indiana Code 36-1-8-11 provides that a payment to a city or a town, and that would include your utilities, can be made by any of the following instruments that your council authorizes. So that can be obviously cash. They can authorize to accept checks, a bank draft, money orders, credit cards, electronic funds transfers, and then PayPal or any other kind of electronic payment method like that, as long as they approve it. And of course, you're going to want to keep internal controls in mind, especially with the PayPal or Venmos. If you're collecting those, certain people have access to those PayPals and other people don't, and you just really want to think about your internal controls if you're going to accept PayPal payments. In subsection 11F of that statute, it provides you can contract with a bank or a credit card vendor to accept bank or credit cards. However, if there is a vendor transaction charge, you can collect from the person using the card a charge to offset that cost. And what statute provides says you can either charge an official fee, and that can't exceed the actual transaction charge that is charged to you, or you can charge a convenience fee that's not to exceed $3. And that has to be uniformly charged to everyone. So, if someone's using a Visa card or a Discover card, it has to be the same convenience fee charged, regardless of what they're using. You just have to apply that uniformly. Or you can charge both, the official fee and the convenience fee if you wanted. So we get questions about that a lot, if you can charge that or if you have to charge that. You don't have to. I do know there are some communities that have accepted that charge as a cost of doing business, for lack of a better term, and not pass that along. You certainly can charge it, again, if your council authorizes it, but you don't have to. So I want to make that clear. And then in section 11F also says that these fees can be charged regardless of any agreements with the bank or credit card vendors that prohibit it. So in accepting or taking certain credit cards at your locations, if that vendor agreement had something included in it that said you can't pass along those costs, you'll want to have your attorney advise you about 36111F as to how that statute says that you can collect those fees regardless of what your agreement might prohibit. And then in 11G, so 36111G, it gives you the authority to pay any related service charges. So sometimes we get questions about paying certain charges or fees. People will say, I thought we were prohibited from paying service charges or finance charges or late fees, those kind of things. This statute gives you the authority to pay any fees that are or service charges that are related to accepting a credit card payment. Now let's take some time and get into dispersing money electronically. And probably the most common method that we see is the use of credit cards. And you can use, you can have and use credit cards if you have a policy that's been adopted by your council in the form of either a resolution or an ordinance. And there are specific items that need to be included in that policy, and you can find those in Chapter 1 of the Cities and Towns Manual. And when we talk about credit cards and having a credit card policy, there's also in Chapter 1 provisions for a debit card policy if your unit decides to have a debit card either instead of or in addition to a credit card. So you want to check out Chapter 1 and what the requirements for each of those policies need to be. They basically should include the purpose for which the card can be used and which employees in your city or town are going to have custody of those cards. And that can be by position. It doesn't have to be by name because obviously names are going to change. People are going to move around. So if your policy says that the clerk treasurer is going to have custody of those cards, or the deputy clerk treasurer, or the city controller, whomever, that can be part of your policy. You want to remember too that the cards should not be used to bypass the claims process. If we see a unit using a credit card primarily as their method of dispersing funds, as in order to maybe bypass the claims process, that can be an issue in an audit, and we would want to have a conversation with you at that time. But the power to use a credit card should not be to bypass any of the other prescribed guidelines or systems that are in place. And your policy should also talk about the requirements for supporting documentation, receipts being required, when they're to be turned in, how often, when the card is returned, or how that process is going to work, how those receipts are going to get to the fiscal officer's office in order to have when the credit card claim comes or statement comes in, so that they can be matched up and you can make that payment. So those are things to keep in mind about your policy. Again, in Chapter 1, the Cities and Towns Manual will give you a lot more specific information. And what we're going to audit for when we get to the portion of an audit where we're looking at your credit cards, as you've heard us say numerous times, internal controls are important. And it's no different with having a credit card and how you're using that. So during an audit, we're going to look at your controls over that card use. We're going to want to see the supporting documentation, the paid receipts when someone's used a card, just like we would with any other claim, and its supporting documentation. We'll determine if the card was used for the permitted purposes, and we'd consider we'd look at the paid receipt that goes along with that credit card being paid. So we're going to look for the original receipt. So if I go out to Menards and use the credit card, they're going to give me a receipt. I need to bring that back and get it to you. Now, one thing about the original receipts is you might want to consider on some of the ones that are like heat printed, maybe copying that receipt and attaching the actual receipt to the copy. And that's because those heat printed receipts tend to fade over time. And if it's a few years between our engagements, those might fade and not be readable by the time we come in to audit them. I know the ones that seem to fade the most are, at least in my experience, are the ones that maybe you get at the gas pump. If you can think about you use a credit card at the gas pump and it spits out that receipt, that there isn't ink used in that. It's actually heat printed, and it's printed on thermal paper. It's a chemically coated paper that produces text and images when heat's applied to it. And that kind of paper is very susceptible to heat and ultraviolet light. So that extended exposure to that can cause those receipts to fade. And if we come in, 2 or 3 years after a transaction, that receipt is faded and we can't read it, then that can create some issues. So an easy way to remedy that is to just simply copy it. Not that you have to copy every credit card receipt that you get, but I think you'll be able to tell which ones are actually printed versus the ones that are heat printed on that thermal paper. Just keep that in mind, that you don't want to wait until an audit to find out, oh, these receipts can't be read by the auditors, and that become an issue for you. Oh my gosh, sorry. And also remember too that you can't pay from the credit card statement alone. We see that sometimes. If the statement comes in and it's $1,000 and you write a check for $1,000 and you don't have supporting documentation from that, that's going to be an issue. You should get the credit card statement and have those receipts already on file that you can match up to all the purchases listed on the credit card receipt, patch all that information together, and then pay that out. And lastly, I want to talk about late fees and interest, and I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier when we get questions about, I thought we were exempt from paying late fees and interest, and no, there's nothing in statute that says you don't have to pay late fees on anything, including credit card statements. Where I think some of that confusion comes in is from our Cities and Towns Manual does talk about there's no authority for that, and the theory behind our position is that you all should have the tools at your access to pay things and pay them timely, and therefore not incur these late fees. So if we see late fees or interest that are paid not only on credit cards but any other type of claim, that is something that creates an audit issue. And if we find that it's happening a lot, if it's very pervasive to your unit, we have asked people to reimburse the city or town if those late fees are getting charged. And we get a lot of questions on making electronic payments. And you can make electronic payments that you initiate through your bank's online bill pay method. through ACHs or other similar type of methods. And this is permitted under Indiana Code 36-1-8-11.5. That statute requires your council to adopt a resolution to authorize an electronic transfer of money for the payment of your claims, and that does include your utility claims. So if you've not ever done that before, and maybe you've got a vendor or two requesting that, or maybe even demanding that, you have to have that resolution in place. Your council has to authorize that before you can make electronic payments like that. So when you're paying someone directly in that way. And you still have to comply with other statutory provisions, just like if you were writing a check. For example, Indiana Code 511-10-1.6 is a statute that talks about the issuance of claims and what needs to happen before the fiscal officer can issue a warrant or a check. Those are, you got to have a claim, you've got to have invoice, you've got to have a certification from the person that ordered them. You as a fiscal officer have to audit that claim, and then council has to approve it. So those are all things that are contained in 511-10-1.6. Or you can have an ordinance in cities under 36-4814, or in towns 36-5412, where you can pay certain types of expenses prior to the council approval. I'm going to touch on that in a couple more slides in a little more detail. An issue that comes up quite often, I know that we get calls and emails about it. We've talked about this with you when we were meeting at our resource tables, at our various events, but paying for something in advance of actually receiving those goods or services. You're buying a new fire truck, or you're having a new shed built out back behind the town hall, and somebody wants 50% deposit so they can go out and buy the materials and then come back and construct it, and then you pay the second half when you're done. We really don't know of any statutory provisions for that, so that's why we say generally you can't pay for goods and services prior to receiving those goods or services. That's also documented in the Cities and Towns Manual in Chapter 1 on page 1-3, as well as a statute that I just talked about, 511-10-1.6. Part of those 5 things that I mentioned before you can issue a check, one of them, it requires that the person receiving the goods or services has to approve the invoice. And that's hard to do, we believe, if those items haven't been received yet. About the only exceptions that we're aware of where you can pay things in advance are you can pay meal advances for city and town employees who are traveling on official business, but you have to have an ordinance first to allow that. So I know some communities, some councils may not want to do that. And so in those cases, you couldn't. In other cases, if you have the ordinance, you'd want to, comply with the provisions of that ordinance. And it may say, we're going to advance so much for this person to travel, and maybe they have actual expenses over that amount, and maybe they're going to get reimbursed the difference when they get back. But you can, and it's in 511-10-1.6, that you can pay meal advances to city employees and town employees who are traveling on official business. So in an audit, if we were to see that, we would want to see A, the ordinance that permits it, and B, some documentation for that travel, that official travel that the person was doing. And in cities only, 36-489 states that you can pay compensation prior to an employee's vacation starting if that person is a salaried position. I haven't found anything similar for town employees, so as we're aware of, this just applies to cities. And the final exception is If you're paying for PSAP equipment, and PSAP is public safety answering point, or your dispatch centers, your 911 call centers, most of those are in counties, but there are some cities that actually have that. If you're buying that type of equipment, they put this provision in the statute, I assume, so that you're not waiting for delivery. If you need something that is involved in that public safety, you can go ahead and purchase it in advance of actually receiving those items. Now, a couple of slides ago, I mentioned paying in advance of council approval. That's not the same thing as paying for things in advance of getting them. And sometimes that gets confusing for officials. You can pay for things in advance of council approval if you have an ordinance that allows it, and that ordinance describes the items that council is okay with you paying. So for cities, that's Indiana Code 36-4-8-14. In towns, it's 36-5412. And when you look in that statute, there's a list of several things that you can already pay, like taxes to the government. I think there may be some insurance things in there that you can pay in advance of council approval. And then the last in that list of 11 or 12 things is, or anything described in an ordinance. So if your council is okay with things being paid as they come in prior to their approval, if they just describe it in the ordinance, that would be okay with us in an audit. Credit card bills is a good example. That's not one of the statutory listed things, but if your council adopts this ordinance and they want to allow you to pay the credit card statement, the bill when it comes in, if they include that in the ordinance, that will not be an issue with us. And sometimes those bills come in before the next council meeting might happen, and so you don't have a chance to get them. They don't have a chance to approve it prior to it being due, and then if you're late, you get those late charges, and as we talked about earlier, so you want to try to avoid that. So if that's not included in your ordinance currently, or if you don't have an ordinance currently, talk to your council about getting that in there so that when those credit card bills come in, you can go ahead and pay them. And then that's not to say council doesn't approve it ever. So at the next regular meeting, well, it doesn't have to be the next regular meeting, but at a next public meeting, when they're approving claims, they would want to include those ones you've already paid, like the credit card bill, or maybe your utility bill, maybe the gas company sends you your bill and it's due before the next meeting. Go ahead and pay that if that's part of your ordinance. Another thing to keep in mind on paying money electronically, I talked about a little bit on receiving money, but paying money electronically is your internal controls. I know that's everyone's favorite subject. I've got the picture of the cube that we've used before, and I'm sure you've seen it, probably sick of seeing it, but internal controls, we can't stress those enough. I continue to see in our audit reports that are coming out comments for controls not being adequate. So Mike and I are going to stress that every time we get the chance to about your internal controls. And electronic payments themselves require electronic controls, and those controls probably ought to be a little tighter than maybe what your paper checks is, just by the nature of an electronic transaction. That somebody, when you're writing a check, there's that physical piece of paper, someone's signing it, someone might see you sign it, but when we get in electronics, it's somebody sitting down at a computer and typing things in and shooting them off to get paid. So you want to have your controls in place to help protect your unit from unauthorized use or erroneous use. And some factors you want to consider in your electronic internal controls aren't that different than your regular controls, other than maybe maybe a little more segregation of duties, for example. Factor that in as you can. I know there are a lot of one-person offices out there. making these payments. So get someone else involved the best that you can. You want to think about reviews, who can review electronic payments, approvals, who's going to be able to approve them, and then how you're going to document all of that, all of the review and the segregation and the approvals. Because you've heard us talk about before, when we come in and do an audit, maybe it's 2 or 3 years down the road, it's not enough to say, well, here's our internal controls in writing, and it says A, B, and C are going to happen. We need to see that A, B, and C happened. And so somebody reviews your electronic payments, we need to see evidence of that, a signature, initials on something, an email that they reviewed it. And the same with approvals. Maybe they're reviewing and approving, or maybe that's 2 separate people doing that. But those approvals we need to see as well. We need to know someone's looked at something and someone and that person in authority to approve it is approving it. Again, initial, signature, an email, something to document for the field examiners when they come in a couple of years down the road, that here are your controls and here we can see evidence that those were being followed. Okay, this slide's not in your packet, but I found this cartoon a little humorous. I hope I haven't put you all in a state of unconsciousness, and I hope you're all awake. But as the one person is saying here, I hope you don't mind if I bring my pillow and blanket to your presentation, because the last time you presented, I lost consciousness and broke my nose on the table. And I know I'm not the most exciting speaker around, but I hope this isn't how I find you right now. If it is, kind of perk up a little bit, because what I'm going to talk about now before I turn it over to Mike is about initiating electronic payments yourself or pushing the money out versus a third-party vendor going into your bank account and pulling the money out. We've talked about this very briefly in some other settings, but I wanted to kind of touch base on that, about that topic now, so you want to make sure that you kind of hear this. We're not aware of any statute that really permits a vendor to have access to your bank account and pull money out, and pull however much they want to pull out. Our position is that the fiscal agent is the only one statutorily permitted to disperse public funds, not a vendor. So if a vendor is coming in and pulling money out of one of your bank accounts, they're actually dispersing that because they're taking it from you. You're not doing it yourselves. So you can push an electronic payment out. For example, let's say your gas vendor, Vectron or whatever their name is now, Centerpoint, I think. If they were to get into your bank account each month and take out the amount of your bill, that would be pulling it out. That would be something that could create an audit issue. If Vectron were to notify you, hey, your bill's $100 this month, and you went online and generated or initiated a payment of $100 to them, and assuming it went through the other hoops of approvals and documentation and blah, 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 that would be okay, because you then are initiating that payment. They've told you how much it is, and you're pushing it out. It's the same as writing a check. They might send you an invoice. Here's how much you owe. You write a check, you send it out. Here they're letting you know how much you owe. And instead of writing that check, you're going online and pushing that money out to them and paying your bill. The only time that I can think of, before Charlie retired, when I was out in the field, I did the PERF audit and the Teachers Retirement Fund audit a couple of times, and then I did it once when they merged into MPERS, and that became one entity, and did the MPERS audit. And that was about the time when you went from reporting and making contributions quarterly to every pay period. And there's language when that change happened in their statute, in MPERS's statute, about them having the ability to pull money out. So you report to them, here's our contributions for this pay period, and they can come take that. That's the only time I'm aware of in statute that somebody can pull money out of your account. So we've not taken exception to that, obviously. I know a lot of you have asked about other situations that you have, primarily with insurance. Maybe the person handling your insurance tells you that the claims for a week or something are X amount of dollars, and they are able to go in and take that out because you have some agreement with them. And that's kind of their standard operating procedures. That's the way they set it up. While that is technically not the permitted method, I don't know that we would take audit exception to that unless it became a huge issue. Like maybe they were taking more out than they were supposed to. I think if you're allowing that, you're always opening yourself up to a potential comment. I can't think of any times when we have written that up in recent memory, but that's not to say that it couldn't happen if we find that in an audit. I just want to alert you to that and not be alarmed if you've got something set up currently that way. I would recommend seeing if you can switch that over or working with them to where in the insurance example, if they say, hey, your claims for the week are $50,000, if you can then initiate a payment out to them for the $50,000 that they then handle like they normally would, instead of them just coming in and getting it. So I know there are probably different methods out there going around, and hopefully you have some controls in place on how you're all handling that. But I did just want to let you know that technically letting somebody come in and pull money out of your bank account without you initiating it originally is something that could that we could take exception to in an audit. So I wanted to point that out as we kind of wrapped up the electronic transactions part of our presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike, and he's going to talk about some things, and then we will get into the Q&As when he's done. So Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. All good stuff from Todd there. Stuff we've been receiving questions on lately. I'm going to, like Todd said, go briefly over nepotism because we've been receiving questions on it lately and wanted to provide clarification on our agency position. Importantly, first off, there's two separate statutes, one covering nepotism, which is Indiana Code 36-1-20.2. And the other one is Indiana Code 36-1-21, which is going over contracting policies. So for the first one that I mentioned, individuals who are not relatives may not be employed by a unit in a position that results in one relative being in the direct line of supervision of another relative. For example, the mother is the clerk treasurer of the city. The city hires their high school age child for summer help in the parks department. This child works in the parks department, so he would report to the parks director. This would be allowable. Now, say if their child worked in the clerk treasurer's office and reported to the clerk treasurer, then that would be something that we would look into further, possibly violating code. The next slide, it covers Indiana Code 35-44.1-1-4, which provides the definitions of dependents and other issues for conflict of interest, which we'll be covering later. They define relative as a spouse, parent, or step-parent, child or stepchild, brother, sister, half-brother, half-sister, stepbrother, stepsister, niece or nephew, aunt or uncle, daughter-in-law or son-in-law, and adopted child is considered the same as a natural child. I know that's a long list, so if you have any questions on that, feel free to reach out to us or even better, your attorney when dealing with nepotism or contracting issues. With that being said, some individuals may be grandfathered in. Indiana Code 36-1-20.2-2 says an individual who's employed by a unit on July 1st, 2012 is not subject to this chapter unless the individual has a break in employment with the unit. The following are not considered a break in employment with the unit. The individual is absent from the workplace while on paid or unpaid leave, including vacation, sick, family medical leave, or workers' compensation. The other option is the individual's employment with the unit is terminated following by immediate reemployment by the unit without loss of payroll time. Something I was thinking about with regards to the statute is that if you're employed by a city and then as a clerk treasurer, then you leave and become employed by the county possibly, we do not believe this would be applicable, that you would not be grandfathered in still. On the next slide, we're going to talk about the direct line of supervision for the nepotism statute, Indiana Code 36-1-20.2-4A. A person is in the direct line of supervision of an elected officer or employee if the elected officer or employee is in a position to affect the terms and conditions of the individual's employment, including making decisions about work assignments, compensation, grievances, advancements, or performance evaluation. Direct line of supervision does not include the responsibilities of the executive, legislative body, or fiscal body to make decisions regarding salary ordinances, budgets, or personnel policies of the unit. For the annual certification portion of the nepotism and contracting policies, Indiana Code 36-1-20.2-16, each elected official of the unit annually certifies in writing, subject to the penalties of perjury, that the officer has not violated this chapter. An officer shall submit the certifications to the unit executive no later than December 31st of each year. And on the next slide, we're going to talk about kind of what you need to do as a unit yearly. I know most units are doing this, but there are still some that are not. So both statutes require local policies be adopted to separate policies, and they will be uploaded twice. Both policies can be adopted into one, but must address both statutes. And these policies are what is required to be uploaded into Gateway. They'll have to be uploaded both times, like 2 times, because that's how our Gateway system works. DLGF may not pass your budget without these. That's up to them, depending on other circumstances. We are just giving them the information on whether you have included these policies in your Gateway report. So just a few reminders that Indiana Code 36-1-21-7, this covers both contracting and nepotism. If the State Board of Accounts finds that a unit has not implemented a policy under this chapter, the State Board of Accounts shall forward the information to the Department of Local Government Finance, DLGF. So basically that's saying if we find an issue with the policy or no policy, then we'll send the information to DLGF. Like I said in prior slides, DLGF has the power to not approve the budget or any additional appropriations for the year until SBOA has certified the unit is in compliance. Another reminder is Indiana Code 36-1-21-8, covering contracting and nepotism. If a unit has not implemented a policy under this chapter, the Department of Local Government and Finance may not approve the unit's budget or any additional appropriations in this budget. This can be applied for the ensuing calendar year until we recertify that the DLGF to GLGF that the unit is in compliance with this chapter. And for my last slide, I'm just going to bring up a new law that has been discussion we've had some questions on and things like that. It's Indiana Code 36-1-30-2. On or before January 31st, all local units of government should submit to us a report of each individual local unit that has an employee that is being paid from donation dollars. So basically, the state is trying to capture all donations used on payroll, especially for the specific purpose of temporary election workers. What we're trying to do is create an adjustment on the 100R that is already due January 31st of each year, to have basically like a checkbox that you be able to check if any of your employees, any city or town employee is going to be, their payroll is going to be funded via donation. This will not affect most of you. Most of you will answer no, but we will update you more information, with more information that's coming down the pipeline. We're working with our gateway people right now to make this a smooth process for everyone. I would also like to note that this does not include state or federal grants. This is donations for a specific purpose. I'd like to repeat, this does not include state or federal grants. I know we'll get quite a few questions on this, I'm sure. But with that, I wrapped up my portion of the presentations, and here's a contact info, and looks like we have quite a few questions in our inbox. So I'm gonna let Todd go first and answer a few questions, and then I'll hop in as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Sometimes I have trouble doing one thing and talk